What if everything we thought we knew about the Nancy Guthrie case was wrong? For months, the public has treated this mystery like a straightforward abduction. A masked man, a late-night disappearance, strange ransom notes, blood on the porch. But now, investigators, profilers, and former agents are asking a far more disturbing question. What if parts of the crime scene were staged to mislead everyone from the very beginning? On this episode of Hidden Killers Live, Tony Bruschi and retired FBI Special Agent Robin Dreeke dive deep into the growing confusion surrounding one of the most baffling true crime investigations in recent memory. From bizarre behavior caught on surveillance footage to conflicting law enforcement decisions and theories that range from calculated kidnapping to elaborate cover-up, this case has spiraled into a maze of contradictions. Why was the family cleared so quickly? Why did the alleged kidnappers never seriously pursue money? And why does the so-called porch guy look less like a professional criminal and more like someone acting out a strange performance? As investigators continue chasing leads that seem to go nowhere, critics are beginning to question whether crucial mistakes, ego, and inexperience may have damaged the case from the start. Former agents argue that key evidence may have been overlooked, valuable time may have been wasted, and public communication from officials may have fueled conspiracy theories instead of shutting them down. From theories involving staged evidence to questions about AI-generated ransom notes and the possibility of multiple offenders, this breakdown explores every uncomfortable angle surrounding the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The deeper they dig, the stranger it gets, and the most terrifying possibility of all may be that the truth has been hiding behind a carefully crafted illusion the entire time. The deeper investigators looked into the Nancy Guthrie case, the more the timeline itself began to feel unstable. Every answer seemed to create three new questions. Every confirmed fact came with an asterisk attached to it. And after nearly 6 months of dead ends, failed leads, public criticism, and non-stop speculation, one uncomfortable reality started settling in over the investigation. This was no longer just a missing person case. It had become a war over narrative. On one side were investigators insisting they were methodically working the evidence behind the scenes. On the other side was an increasingly frustrated public watching a case that appeared frozen in place while theories multiplied by the day. Somewhere in the middle sat Nancy Guthrie's family, grieving, scrutinized, and trapped inside a media firestorm they never asked for. And looming over all of it was the image that had become synonymous with the case itself. Porch guy. The blurry surveillance figure moving awkwardly across the property in oversized clothing, tactical gear, gloves, and what appeared to be some kind of weapon holster. A figure that, according to many observers, didn't resemble a professional abductor at all. "He looks like somebody pretending to be dangerous," Tony Bruschi said during the discussion. That observation may sound simplistic, but it reflects one of the biggest psychological fractures in the entire case. Because when experienced investigators look at criminal behavior, they aren't just analyzing what someone did, they're analyzing how they did it. And according to Robin Dreeke and Jennifer Coffindaffer, the behavior here feels deeply off. Professional kidnappings, especially those motivated by money, usually follow patterns. There's efficiency, planning, communication, a clear objective. Criminals seeking ransom typically establish control quickly, maintain leverage over the victim, and immediately begin managing negotiations. None of that appears to have happened here. Instead, what investigators saw was chaos. Open doors, strange movements, delayed ransom communications, confusing Bitcoin demands, no proof of life, no meaningful negotiation process, no financial extraction strategy, no escalation. It almost felt like somebody understood the idea of a kidnapping without understanding how kidnappings actually work. That distinction matters, because criminals who imitate crimes they've only seen in movies often leave behind behavioral inconsistencies. They focus on appearance instead of function. They recreate stereotypes instead of realities. And Porch Guy, according to several analysts following the case, may represent exactly that kind of performance. Even his clothing raised questions. Why wear such exaggerated gear to abduct an elderly woman? Why the bulky gloves? Why the awkward movement? Why the apparent obsession with looking tactical? If the objective was speed and stealth, the outfit seemed counterproductive. It drew attention rather than avoiding it. Robin described it bluntly. He's not acting like a normal home invader. He's acting like somebody playing a role. That possibility opens the door to an entirely different interpretation of the crime scene. Not necessarily that the entire abduction was fake. Most investigators still believe Nancy likely died that night, but that certain elements of the scene may have been intentionally exaggerated to manipulate investigators. And if that's true, then the offender may have been psychologically focused less on escaping and more on storytelling. That idea changes everything, because staged crime scenes are not uncommon. Criminals stage burglaries, they stage suicides, they stage break-ins, Sometimes they even stage motivations. But staging introduces risk. The more details a criminal adds, the more opportunities they create for mistakes. Which is why many profilers believe stage scenes often reveal the offender's personality more than authentic ones do. Overcompensation, excessive detail, forced symbolism, unnecessary theatrics. These things can point toward offenders who desperately want investigators to see the crime a certain way. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, there are plenty of people wondering whether that's exactly what happened. But Robin Dreeke also pushed back against some of the more extreme theories circulating online. He made it clear that while partial staging seemed possible, the idea that the entire abduction never occurred stretches logic too far. Nancy's pacemaker data reportedly indicated she was home. Blood evidence existed at the property. Doors were open. Surveillance captured movement around the house. To fake all of that convincingly would require an incredibly elaborate conspiracy involving multiple moving parts, near-perfect timing, and a level of sophistication that doesn't align with the bizarre behavior already seen in the case. It stops making sense pretty quickly, Tony admitted. And that's become one of the defining frustrations of the investigation. Almost every theory eventually collapses under its own weight. The family theory creates logistical contradictions. The ransom theory creates behavioral contradictions. The professional kidnapping theory creates competency contradictions. The random predator theory creates targeting contradictions. Nothing fits cleanly. Even the ransom notes themselves continue fueling debate. Robin revealed that many investigators remain skeptical that the messages were ever legitimate ransom communications at all. In his view, the demands lacked the structure and urgency typically associated with real extortion attempts. If money was truly the motive, why was there never a serious attempt to collect it? Why no controlled communication strategy? Why no sustained contact? Why no escalating threats tied to deadlines? Why no credible proof Nancy was alive? Instead, the messages appeared sporadic, emotionally manipulative, and oddly theatrical. That's where the AI discussion entered the conversation. And surprisingly, the theory isn't as far-fetched as it initially sounds. Modern AI systems can generate frighteningly convincing personalized messages using publicly available information. Photos, interviews, social media posts, news footage, public records, all of it can be synthesized into highly believable content. Robin explained how AI could theoretically generate detailed ransom-style communications using only publicly accessible data about Nancy and her family. Things like room layouts, personal habits, clothing preferences, family dynamics, routines, even emotional language patterns could potentially be predicted with alarming accuracy. And unlike humans, AI doesn't get tired. It doesn't forget details. It excels at pattern recognition. That possibility creates a terrifying new dimension to modern criminal investigations. Because in past decades, certain details inside ransom notes were considered strong indicators of authenticity. References only insiders would know carried tremendous evidentiary weight. But today, some of those inside details may no longer be inside details at all. A criminal armed with AI tools and enough publicly available information could potentially manufacture credibility almost instantly, and investigators now have to operate in that reality. Still, Robin emphasized that most experienced investigators already believed the odds of Nancy surviving beyond that first night were tragically low. The statistics alone were devastating. An 82-year-old abducted violently from her home in the middle of the night with blood evidence at the scene and no confirmed proof of life afterward? Survival odds in those cases are extremely poor. That harsh reality sits underneath every public discussion of the case, even when nobody says it out loud. The family likely knows it, investigators likely know it, the public senses it, but without answers, hope continues lingering in the background, and hope changes how people interpret evidence. That's one reason the ransom notes had such emotional power. Even flawed hope is still hope. And in high-profile cases, hope becomes dangerous territory because it clouds judgment on every side. Families cling to possibilities. The public clings to theories. Investigators feel pressure to maintain optimism even when evidence points elsewhere. Meanwhile, online speculation grows more aggressive. And according to Robin, Sheriff Chris Nanos unintentionally made that problem far worse. One of the biggest controversies surrounding the case remains the speed with which the family was publicly cleared. Robin acknowledged that investigators absolutely should examine family members first in virtually every missing person or homicide case. Statistically, that's standard procedure. But he argued the public communication surrounding the clearing was mishandled from the beginning. Instead of carefully explaining the investigative process, Nanos reportedly issued blunt statements dismissing suspicions while offering little transparency about how those conclusions were reached. That vacuum created fuel for conspiracy theories, and once conspiracy theories gain momentum online, they become nearly impossible to stop. Robin compared it to a leadership failure in crisis communication. You can't just say, "Trust me," anymore, he explained. Modern audiences demand process. They demand evidence. They demand consistency. And when officials contradict themselves publicly, even unintentionally, trust erodes rapidly. According to critics, Nanos repeatedly damaged credibility through inconsistent statements, emotional press conferences, and defensive reactions to criticism. Tony described it as a pattern of communication driven more by ego than strategy. And whether that assessment is fair or not, perception matters in high-profile investigations. Because once the public loses confidence in leadership, every unanswered question becomes suspicious. Why was the car held so long? Why wasn't more surveillance released? Why weren't certain forensic details explained? Why weren't investigative milestones clarified? Even perfectly reasonable investigative decisions start looking sinister when trust breaks down. Robin stressed that many of those decisions probably did have legitimate explanations. Holding on to the daughter's vehicle, for example, could easily have been about collecting trace DNA from anyone who may have interacted with Nancy, not suspicion toward the family themselves. But because investigators failed to explain those possibilities clearly, speculation filled the silence. And in today's digital environment, speculation spreads faster than facts, especially when a case already feels cinematic. Masked intruders, midnight abductions, Bitcoin ransom notes, tactical gear, open doors, blood evidence, surveillance footage. The Nancy Guthrie case almost feels engineered for internet obsession, which makes the absence of resolution even more maddening. Jennifer Coffindaffer argued that investigators should have aggressively focused public attention on Porch Guy from the start. Billboards, flyers, community outreach, Spanish-language campaigns, massive public identification efforts. In her view, Porch Guy remains the single strongest lead in the case, not because investigators know who he is, but because somebody out there probably does. Even heavily disguised individuals reveal themselves through movement, posture, gait, body type, habits, and behavior. Friends recognize friends, co-workers recognize co-workers, family members recognize relatives. Human beings are remarkably good at identifying familiar movement patterns, even from poor footage. That's why Jennifer believes flooding the public with the image could still matter, because eventually somebody might stop and say, "Wait a second, I know that walk." She also criticized the apparent failure to preserve additional forensic evidence from the scene early enough, particularly things like doormats and entryway contamination zones. To ordinary people, a doormat seems insignificant. To experienced investigators, it can be a goldmine. Mud, fibers, pollen, pet hair, debris, microscopic transfer evidence. Every surface touched during a crime scene interaction carries potential forensic value, and according to Jennifer, investigators may have underestimated how much trace evidence offenders could have left behind, especially if multiple people were involved. That possibility, multiple offenders, remains another key point of discussion. Robin noted the apparent radio antenna visible near Porch Guy's clothing and the repeated glances off-camera that suggest possible coordination with someone else nearby. If true, the operation may have involved at least two individuals, one physically entering the property, while another remained positioned outside. That theory also better explains the logistics of moving Nancy quickly. But again, even that theory introduces problems. If there were multiple offenders, why was the operation so sloppy? Why leave doors open? Why create such visible surveillance exposure? Why fail at ransom collection? Unless the kidnapping itself was never the primary objective. That's the terrifying possibility sitting underneath all these conversations. What if the offender's real goal wasn't money at all? What if the abduction was personal, emotional, obsessive, or something else entirely? Because when motive becomes unclear, criminal behavior becomes much harder to predict. And that's where the case remains frozen today, stuck between competing narratives. An abduction that doesn't behave like an abduction. A ransom scenario that doesn't behave like ransom. A crime scene that feels partially authentic and partially theatrical. An investigation struggling under public scrutiny. And a victim whose disappearance continues haunting everyone involved. 6 months later, Nancy Guthrie is still gone. No arrests, no body, no definitive answers, just fragments. And somewhere inside those fragments is the truth investigators are still desperately trying to find. As the investigation dragged deeper into its 6th month, another unsettling pattern began emerging around the Nancy Guthrie case. Not just confusion, but exhaustion. The public was exhausted. Investigators were exhausted. Even experienced analysts who had spent decades studying violent crime admitted that this case was becoming psychologically draining in ways they hadn't expected. Because unresolved cases do something strange to people. Human beings are wired to seek conclusions. We naturally organize events into narratives with beginnings, middles, and endings. We want motives to make sense. We want actions to connect logically. We want villains who fit recognizable patterns. But the Nancy Guthrie case refuses to cooperate with that instinct. Every time investigators think they're narrowing the possibilities, the evidence fractures again. And according to Robin Dreeke, that's often where dangerous investigative mistakes happen. When people become desperate for clarity, he explained, they start forcing certainty where certainty doesn't exist. That pressure can infect everyone involved. Law enforcement agencies feel pressure to show progress. Media figures feel pressure to provide answers. Online communities feel pressure to solve the mystery themselves. And eventually, theories stop being treated like theories. They harden into camps. One side becomes convinced the family knows more than they're saying. Another side becomes convinced Porch Guy acted alone. Others believe the ransom notes are genuine. Others think the entire ransom narrative was fabricated from the start. And somewhere inside all of that noise, the actual investigation risks becoming distorted by public emotion. Tony Bruschi pointed out that this exact phenomenon has happened in countless high-profile cases before. Once internet speculation reaches a certain level, every detail becomes interpreted through pre-existing beliefs. If someone already suspects law enforcement incompetence, every mistake confirms corruption. If someone believes the family is innocent, every accusation feels cruel. If someone believes the crime scene was staged, every odd detail becomes proof. Confirmation bias takes over. And in Nancy's case, there are enough strange details to feed almost any theory. That's what makes the case so uniquely combustible. Even small inconsistencies suddenly feel massive. Take the issue of timing. One of the most debated elements remains the narrow window between Nancy arriving home and the suspected abduction. Critics continue questioning whether the offender could realistically have known her movements so precisely unless surveillance had been occurring for days or even weeks beforehand. Jennifer Coffindaffer believes that's highly likely. In her assessment, Porch Guy probably conducted pre-operational surveillance at least twice before the actual incident. She referenced suspicious appearances near the property on previous dates and suggested the offender may have been studying routines carefully. That possibility points toward premeditation. But if the crime was heavily premeditated, why does so much of the execution feel amateurish? Again, the contradictions pile up. Experienced kidnappers don't usually improvise communication strategies after the abduction. Experienced kidnappers don't typically expose themselves on surveillance longer than necessary. Experienced kidnappers don't allow operations to collapse almost immediately, unless something went catastrophically wrong. That theory, that Nancy may have died unintentionally during the abduction, continues to gain traction among many analysts. Robin described a scenario where the offenders may have planned a quick snatch and ransom operation without understanding the physical fragility of an elderly victim. Nancy was reportedly on medications that could make even minor injuries bleed significantly. Her skin, as Robin described it, would have been extremely delicate. A forceful restraint, fall, or medical episode during transport could potentially have turned catastrophic very quickly. If that happened, the entire operation may have spiraled into panic. Suddenly, the offenders wouldn't be managing a ransom situation anymore. They'd be managing a homicide. And according to Robin, that could explain the strange shift in behavior afterward. The ransom notes become stalling tactics instead of negotiation tools. The communication becomes erratic. The offenders avoid direct engagement. The objective changes from profit to survival. But even that theory leaves unresolved problems. Why continue communicating at all if the victim is already dead? Why risk additional exposure? Some analysts believe the answer may be psychological rather than practical. Criminals often struggle to abandon a failed plan immediately. Once emotionally committed to a narrative, they sometimes continue performing parts of it long after it no longer serves a rational purpose. In other words, the ransom notes may have represented denial, an attempt to keep the illusion alive while the offenders scrambled to figure out what to do next. And if AI-assisted communication was involved, as Robin suspects may be possible, generating convincing messages would have been easier than ever. That possibility has sparked broader concerns among investigators beyond this case alone, because the Nancy Guthrie investigation may represent one of the first major true crime cases unfolding fully inside the AI era. Not just AI-generated text, but AI-assisted deception, voice cloning, predictive language generation, synthetic imagery, behavioral modeling. All of it now exists at a level sophisticated enough to complicate criminal investigations in ways law enforcement is only beginning to understand. Robin warned that future investigations may face enormous challenges distinguishing authentic insider knowledge from AI-generated simulations. And unlike fictional Hollywood portrayals, criminals don't need advanced technical expertise to access these tools anymore. Many are publicly available, cheap, simple, fast. That reality changes how investigators evaluate evidence moving forward. A ransom note referencing private details used to strongly imply proximity to the victim. Now? Not necessarily. A stranger with enough online data could potentially manufacture frighteningly accurate personalization. And Nancy Guthrie's case generated enormous amounts of publicly accessible information almost immediately. News reports, interviews, neighborhood footage, family descriptions, photographs, routine details, medical references, all of it became part of the digital ecosystem surrounding the case, which may have unintentionally armed hoaxers, or even offenders, with material to manipulate investigators and the public alike. Tony admitted that realization fundamentally altered how he viewed the Ransom communications. At first, he said, you naturally want to believe there's meaning behind them. Because emotionally, people want hope, even false hope, especially in a case involving an elderly victim who seemed universally loved by those who knew her. Friends described Nancy as kind, sharp, independent, and deeply connected to her community. Nothing about her life suggested obvious enemies or dangerous associations. Which raises another haunting question. Why Nancy? If this truly was a targeted operation, what made her the focus? Robin acknowledged that investigators still don't appear to have identified a compelling motive. Financially, the family wasn't extraordinarily wealthy by the standards typically associated with high-level ransom crimes. The operation itself appears disorganized, the communication strategy failed, the offender behavior feels erratic. So why risk everything for this target? Some theorists have suggested the offender may have held a distorted perception of the family's wealth or influence. Others speculate the crime may have been opportunistic rather than meticulously planned. Jennifer Coffindaffer believes the answer may ultimately come down to accessibility. Nancy represented a vulnerable target with predictable routines, limited physical resistance, and a visible connection to a caring family, likely willing to cooperate quickly under pressure. In other words, the offenders may not have selected the perfect victim. They may have selected the easiest one. That possibility makes the case even darker, because it suggests Nancy's disappearance may have been less about personal obsession and more about cold vulnerability. The wrong person noticing the wrong routine at the wrong time. And if that's true, investigators may not be searching for criminal masterminds at all. They may be searching for deeply incompetent offenders who stumbled into a crime far bigger than they were prepared to handle. Robin repeatedly emphasized something many viewers struggle to accept. Not all violent criminals are intelligent. Some are reckless, impulsive, emotionally immature, driven by fantasy rather than logic. And when those offenders attempt sophisticated crimes, the result often looks exactly like this: chaotic, contradictory, and bizarre. That's why Robin keeps returning to Occam's razor. The simplest explanation may still be the correct one. A poorly planned abduction attempt targeting an elderly woman. Multiple offenders. A victim who likely died unexpectedly during the crime. Panic afterward. Improvised ransom communications. Failed damage control. And a sprawling investigation now trying to untangle the aftermath. But if that theory is accurate, then investigators still face an enormous challenge: finding offenders who may not have obvious criminal sophistication but manage to disappear anyway. And that brings the conversation back to what many believe remains the biggest missed opportunity in the case: public identification efforts surrounding Porch Guy. Jennifer Coffindaffer remains adamant that investigators should have saturated Tucson with the image immediately. Billboards, mailers, gas stations, community centers, Spanish-language outreach, digital campaigns, everything. Because statistically, somebody almost certainly recognizes something. Not necessarily the face, but the movement, the posture, the body shape, the gait, the clothing combination. Even tiny behavioral quirks can trigger recognition. Law enforcement has solved countless cases through exactly those kinds of observations. And yet, critics argue the public rollout in Nancy's case often felt strangely restrained. That restraint has fueled even more speculation online. Some wonder whether investigators feared releasing too much information. Others believe internal disagreements may have slowed decision-making. Robin suggested another possibility entirely: inexperience. He described a broader shift inside modern federal law enforcement following the post-9/11 era, where many investigators who once specialized in violent crime transitioned into counterterrorism roles for years. That shift, he argues, created a generational gap. Many of the seasoned violent crime investigators retired. Meanwhile, newer agents gained experience primarily in intelligence-focused environments rather than traditional homicide and abduction investigations. You don't get instincts without reps, Robin explained. And in his view, certain investigative oversights in this case may reflect exactly that problem. Not incompetence, not laziness, but a lack of accumulated field experience. He even referenced the now infamous discussion about investigators allegedly failing to initially check the roof during early searches, something veteran agents immediately questioned because unusual hiding locations become second nature after years working violent crimes. That kind of institutional knowledge isn't learned in classrooms. It's learned through repetition, failure, casework, experience. And according to Robin, modern agencies may be struggling with a shortage of exactly those battle-tested investigators. Tony agreed, noting that many of the public frustrations surrounding the case stem from a perception that investigators are reacting instead of leading. Every press conference seems defensive. Every update feels incomplete. Every correction damages credibility further. And when public confidence erodes, investigations become even harder because witnesses hesitate, rumors spread faster, and cooperation weakens. Still, despite all the criticism, Robin cautioned against assuming investigators are doing nothing behind the scenes. Complex forensic work takes time. Digital analysis takes time. DNA processing takes time. Geofencing warrants take time. Financial tracing takes time, especially in cases involving massive data collection across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The public sees silence. Investigators may see slow movement. Those are very different realities. But unfortunately, silence creates emotional vacuums. And emotional vacuums inevitably fill with speculation. That's exactly what has happened here. Half a year later, the Nancy Guthrie case exists in two parallel worlds at once. There's the real investigation happening behind closed doors, and then there's the public investigation happening online every single day. The problem is that the public version never sleeps. Every frame gets analyzed, every statement gets dissected, every inconsistency becomes evidence. And until somebody finally answers the central question, what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie that night, the noise surrounding the case is only going to keep growing louder.